Good morning, everybody, and welcome, Dr. Cahalan. It's such a treat to have you with us, and such a treat to have everybody with us. My name is Evan Garner, and I have the privilege and pleasure of serving at St. Paul's as the rector. And one of those great privileges is working with talented people who make things like this happen. What a treat it is to be together. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to offer a couple of introductory comments, and then I'll get out of the way for Laura to introduce our guest today. And I'll be back a little later on to join in the Q&A session. But let me start by saying welcome. If you are joining us on the YouTube live stream, you are welcome to stay where you are and to watch the broadcast. But if you're watching live, we would love for you to join us in the Zoom webinar so that we can hear from you, so that you can participate in the discussion and ask your questions. You can find that link to the Zoom webinar at our church's website. If you navigate there, then there's a link to the Zoom webinar. And if you follow along, you'll be able to participate by offering your comments and your questions. Those of you in the Zoom webinar, glad you're with us. And do remember that the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen, is the best way to share your questions or your comments. Our guest today is an expert when it comes to those Q&A, so she will be monitoring that as well. So don't hesitate to offer your question or your comment during her presentation. She will be able to see that. And if it's appropriate to answer it live, then she will. Otherwise, we'll wait till the end and we'll address that in a Q&A section after her presentation. So do share your comments. Do share your comments there. If you're asking the website on the Zoom, then you're already in the Zoom. I see Maureen is asking about the website. And there you go with the shared comment. One more thing. That's okay. One more thing to let you know about. If you are visiting the Zoom or the YouTube and you haven't signed up officially for the conference, you are welcome to participate, but we would love to be able to be in touch with you as the conference continues, not only to remind you of the links that you will need each week, but also because we hope that this conversation will continue after the conference is over. And we want to invite you to join us in some book studies, some discussion groups, and some further work of discernment. So if you haven't signed up, if you haven't registered, but you are participating, welcome. And I hope that you'll take time to register. You will know that you have registered if you've received an email from us, from St. Paul's with a link to this webinar. But if you didn't get that link, if you're just joining us through the church's website, I would encourage you to take time to sign up so that we can be in touch with you in the weeks ahead. Again, welcome. Glad that you're with us. If you're on YouTube, hope you'll join us through Zoom. If you're on Zoom, don't forget to share your questions or your comments to the Q&A feature, and I'll be back in a little while to help facilitate the Q&A part of our day today. Now, I'd like to invite Laura Cato to come and introduce our guest today. Thank you.
Good morning. My printer's talking. Okay, well, I am Laura Cato. I am a member of St. Paul's Vestry, and I'm on the formation committee, and it's my great pleasure and has been to support Samantha and Evan in putting on this conference. This topic is close to my heart because I watched my brother go through the discernment process to the priesthood, and I marveled at the formalized process, the resources, and the supportive community he had in that series. And then so many times in contrast, as a layperson, I've observed the differences in those two journeys. Hold on. We have vestry retreat today, and that's wanting to print off everything for that, so we're multitasking. But yeah, just the differences between what those two journeys look like and how often as a layperson we are finding a very different journey, very much more self-directed. And then during that, often I've questioned whether my work and my discernment is as valuable as the clergy, both as a layperson and as a woman, which is so funny because Dr. Cahalan and I were corresponding earlier, and I mistakenly addressed her as Reverend, and she warmly reminded me that she too is a layperson and not a clergy member. So we are all going to be okay. And the joke is on us because if you are our model, we're going to be just fine. So today's topic is designed as an introductory session to vocation and discernment. And our speaker for this session is a leader in the topic. Our vision for this series is to describe calling in the world, not always, but sometimes aligned with our jobs and how we can discern our vocation in the community. Dr. Kathleen Cahalan is well known, well respected in the field. She's a professor of practical theology at St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary and director of the Collegeville Institute seminars. She's a graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School for both her master's and her PhD. And her work and research focuses on vocation, work in the professions, along with spiritual wisdom and spiritual practice. Of the many publications and presentations that she has given on the topic of vocation, one that resonates with today's discussion is a presentation given at the Leadership Colloquium as a part of the Berkeley Divinity School at the Yale Divinity School, entitled The Grammar of Vocation, Changing the Way We Talk About Our Callings. And that title links us to her book, The Stories That We Live, Finding God's Call Around Us, which captures the language of vocation in a new way. And in this book, she invites readers to a renewed vision of who they are and what they do by connecting our stories with God's story. She alters the description of calling as a verb and instead discusses vocation in terms of preposition, how each of us is called by God to follow as we are from grief for service, in suffering through others within God. It is my great honor to participate in this as well as introduce our speaker, and we welcome you as warmly as possible via Zoom. So I will hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Laura. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you. So I'm not in Minnesota right now. I'm in the UP, if you know where that is. It's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and we're enjoying some time to ski up here and be in a very wintry place. So I want to begin by showing you a video. So
when I think back to in my 20s, I graduated from school and decided to do some volunteer work in South America. The call story that happened occurred there. I was ending my time in Venezuela, working with youth and working with the females in a Christian community. Powerful year. And as I ended that year, I went on retreat along with the American team that I lived with. And at that retreat, we had some free time, and I went out for a walk in the back space of this retreat house. Beautiful. It was a hilltop, and I was walking around, and I was praying. Not out loud, but just talking with God as I do, and asking God what was the next step for me. I was 23 and far away, and I had a clean palette for what to do with my life. And in that walk, I did get an idea that I might be called to, don't laugh now, be a Christian singer. I have a good voice and performed all through college. And I was ruminating about that and really wanting God to answer that question. And I did hear a voice which I have not heard since, and I had not heard prior, but it was a voice that was very loud and clear in my heart, which said, "Don't worry, Jane. I'll give you the people you need." And I don't know if someone had been there with the tape recorder, if anyone would have heard anything, but I did know that it was God's communicating to me. And I know because of the fruits of that immediately I was at peace. And it gave me some focus for that next year. After that, doors opened to be an actor. And I kept on getting more success to a certain degree. And it was such a joy-filled calling in some ways to use my skills, which had developed quite well. I guess you just need to be flexible with your calling.
Okay, I hope you heard that. I don't see the question and answer. Just a minute here, guys. Well, it'll come up probably. So I hope you heard that video. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the elements that you noticed about Jane's calling? Did you hear or see anything? And you can put them in the Q&A or, I see it now. Oh, good, you did hear it. Okay, what'd you notice about Jane's calling? Anything in particular? She's very open. Absolutely. She is so open. She wants to be flexible. She took a walk and she listened. What's she doing on that walk? She's flexible. She's open. She's praying. She's asking God, what should I do? Right? And when she gets an answer, she's really filled with joy. Okay, great, thanks. Well, like Laura said, I direct a program called the Collegeville Institute Seminars, and these are interdisciplinary, collaborative, ecumenical groups that gather ministers, people in different professions, people in different academic disciplines to explore the notion of calling. And I direct the Lilly Endowment's Called to Lives of Meaning and Purpose initiative, which is funding the VTS's hub program, which I think you're a part of, the Baptists for Life program. So I work with all the organizations that are working with congregations on this theme of calling. And when I started the seminars, back in 2008, I think, we wanted to look at calling across the lifespan, calling in different areas of work, like what Laura does in her work. And we looked at interfaith, interreligious notions of calling. We were not studying calling in ministry. There's a lot that's been done on that. So we had a two-pronged method. The first thing we did was we just listened to people describe their calling, kind of a grounded research approach. And here on the screen, you see we developed this small group program. It's still up. You can use it. It's free. But we developed it so we could just listen to how people talk about God calling them in their lives. And then the second thing we did was we read a lot. But actually, at that time, there was not a lot published about vocation. But I'd say over those 5 years, we listened to hundreds and hundreds of Catholics and Protestants reflect on different questions. Sorry, just a second. Different questions. Oops. This is what I want. And some were so exemplary, like Jane, we made videos of them. But what I'd like to share with you today is, first of all, Jane was really unique. We didn't find Jane among most people in most congregations. And I want to share our initial 5 key findings with you now. Okay, so the first one is that most people did not experience God as a caller in their life. I'm talking about people in congregations who volunteered to be part of our 6-week small group program. I'm not talking about the nuns, that Pew is talking about all the time. I'm talking about people who go to church. So for example, we had a guy, he was a financial analyst and he loved his work. He really liked helping people make hard decisions. He found God in others. He was a dad and a husband, and he coached something on his kids' team. He was so grateful for his life and wanted to give back in community. But he told us, I don't know that I've ever been given a calling. Okay, so even when we found people who thought that they were called to their work, it was also very hard for them to say that God was calling them to that. So that leads to our second major finding, and that most people don't trust their own religious experience, right? So Jane praying, she's hearing something. Operatively, the idea of calling remains rather flat and calculating. Most people we've found thought God might just have some definite plan, and it was their task to figure out this deeply held secret, as if God knew and they didn't. Or most people thought that holy people had callings, or obviously, like Laura thought, maybe ministers have calling, or they get all this attention around their calling, but other people don't. So, but as we asked people to share in their small groups how they came to understand or hear or grasp what God might be calling them to, they would often say, well, you know, this is the first time I've ever told anybody this, but ... So we rarely trust our own religious experiences. The third finding was many think that a vocation is something you figure out in your young adult years. Like young adults think this oftentimes, you know, like that calling has to do with these huge questions in life, like, you know, am I going to be married? What kind of work am I going to do? Where am I going to live? And of course, college students and young adults in the military and who go on to work, they often express to us a deep anxiety and fear that they were going to miss God's one call. So they were confused that God only has one calling for us, but they also felt like all these decisions were made in adult life and that there was one single right answer to the question of vocation. And once you get that question settled, your life just goes on happily ever after. Okay, I hope all the older people are laughing now because, you know, that's not how it works, is it? Go ahead and ask me any questions as I go along. You don't have to wait for the Q&A period, okay? So much of the literature on vocation is written for young adults in school and geared toward making these life decisions. But we found that questions of calling happen all across the lifespan. And from youth to midlife, for those making, for elderly people, older adults, we found calling everywhere. And in fact, retirement in our research ended up to be the single greatest vocational life transition that people were experiencing. And we found that people in late adulthood really mirrors the questions of young adulthood. Who am I? What am I going to do with my life? You know, what can I do? Who are the people? What's my purpose? So I'll say a little bit more about lifespan later. The fourth thing that we discovered was that most churches are not communities of calling, nor do they foster the key practices of vocation, the key spiritual practices, what I would call discernment, prayer, and storytelling. So the majority of people said that their pastors and congregations, for example, had rarely asked them about their work, what they did, why they did it, what they were good at. Congregations generally were not places where most people felt supported in their work. If they did, it was primarily in small group experiences. We had a young pastor who was head of a very prominent downtown Minneapolis church. And she invited business leaders in her community to reflect on these questions as she prepared to preach a sermon about calling to the business life. So she was asking them, how does your faith inform you professionally? How does that impact what you do at Westminster? That's the church. And what do you need your pastors to know about your work? And do you have have you ever experienced a sense of call to what you do professionally? And one of the men in the congregation, who was the vice president of a prominent investment firm in the Twin Cities, said to her, I have to admit that this is the first time in 35 years that one of my pastors ever asked me about what I do. He said, the church asks me to give money because they know I'm a person of wealth. They ask me to give money and they ask me to be on the finance committee because they know I know about money, but they never ask me about what my work means to me. So that was a very interesting calling. And then I also said that people lack the practices, the spiritual practices of vocation. For example, prayer. Hardly anybody prayed about their callings. Jane is asking God, give me some direction here. I need to know, especially younger people don't pray and ask for God's guidance. They didn't know about discernment practices in our tradition, of which there are many. Many people oftentimes look back, have a retrospective sense of making sense of their lives and saying, oh, well, God's hand was at work back there, but they had a harder time identifying in the present tense or going forward as they look down the road where God might be calling them. Like Jay, most thought that they did not have a calling. Okay, fifth, you'll never guess what, most people did not find the language of vocation very compelling. So when I started, I thought I'd find among Protestants and Catholics these operative theologies that have been in our churches for a long time. So among Protestants, the idea that vocation is related to work, and among Catholics that it's related to different states of life, like joining the convent or the monastery or the priesthood, or that vocation had to do with the call of ministry, like Laura thought. And it does have to do with all of those things. And these traditional views do lurk among more common discourse, though they're not as prominent as you might think. What we mostly found was that people had no idea about what vocation means. The term almost always fell flat, and people did not know what it referred to. Here is a central teaching of our faith, a central identity, a central language of the New Testament. And I pretty much found it gone. I'm just going to look in the Q&A, see if you have any questions here. So what happened to that language? Well, I became very interested in that question. And I have two hypotheses. I think one, we in the early modern period, after the Reformation and through the Enlightenment, we had very narrow views of God that rendered the language of vocation almost kind of unbelievable for some people, and so then it gets tossed aside. It's, okay, here's a map, says, search, and you put in your present location here and you type in, okay, I want to go to my future calling, and you think God's just going to give you a roadmap. Okay, so here's Minnesota. I live around here where the cursor is, but I'm up here in the UP right here. Okay, so, I want some direct directions, God. Just tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do or exactly what I'm supposed to be. And this idea, it comes out of a strong sense of God's providence, that God has, sovereignty over history and over our lives. It gets boiled down to the sense that God's got a plan, an exact plan for your life, like what you might have for lunch today or what you're going to do next week or who you're going to marry. But a lot happened in the 20th century that really, that view of God really fell apart. Things like the Holocaust. Really? Did God plan that? It sounds ludicrous. It sounds ridiculous. And so it's just one of my hypothesis that the language of God as a provident deist who has an exact plan for everything and everybody, just became unbelievable for at least some Christians. In many ways too, I think vocation became a doctrine to believe in rather than a practice, rather than something that I do. Second, we lost the language of vocation. Okay, this is an Ngram viewer, and it's for Google Books. Okay, so there's like millions of books in Google, and you can put in words and it'll tell you, the number of times these words appear. And we put in 4 words: vocation, calling, purpose, and meaning. You can see them over here on the right. And we went back to 1800 up to 2000. Well, you can see the word vocation hasn't done very well. It's not a word that is thriving, you might say. It got a little bump here after World War I. That might be because of vocational education, I'm not sure. Calling has done better, but look at the language of meaning and purpose. So my other hypothesis is that we've lost the theological language of calling, but others have discovered and actually profited from it. Here's some titles of books. A lot of books out there with callings in the cover. secular books that have very little religious or theological dimensions to them. And there's some good books out there. I'm not criticizing these books. I'm saying that you can see by word usage, and the more our culture has become more secular, we've lost this language as a religious language, and we find it more and more in secular times. In fact, in the New York Times, they had in the business section, the Sunday business section, they used to have this column called Vocations. And they had so many interesting stories. This guy conducted sea burials, or this person was a quality insurance supervisor. This person was a disc jockey. Now, they weren't religious at all, but they talked about how people found their work and what they loved about it. But even the New York Times couldn't take the language of vocation. They changed the column to what I love. What I love. So the language of purpose, authenticity, meaning, the true self, identity, composing and constructing of life, we're used to this language. It's found in many, many books. So my hypothesis then is God as a caller had little connection for people, and my authentic self as the source of my calling has become a more compelling frame. So in response to these findings, we did several things in our project. We honed our small group process. We stopped asking people what vocation meant to them. We started asking them what was meaningful in their life. We started to use the language of calling more. We started small groups, but we realized that the language of calling had to be more integrated into the life of the congregation in worship, in and through education, and in social justice ministries. It couldn't just stay in small groups. And then we tackled the issue of language. Do you retrieve this language? Do you try to redefine it? Well, I'm a theologian, so I wanted to know what would happen if we looked at and reframed the words around vocation. I'm just looking in the Q&A to see if you have anything for me. Okay, good. Okay, Susan Mays, I'll get back to your question here in a minute. Okay, good, thanks. Okay, so when we frame vocation as a noun, it remains rather static, like we're searching for one object, one that's completely constructed. And then we tend to think of the singular, like I have one vocation, when in fact, really we have multiple callings. Now, if we frame vocation as a verb, it becomes more active, so I'm calling out to God, God's calling out to me, and in my life, God's been known to push me, whisper, shout, nag, restore, heal, guide. So nouns are good because they point to the dynamic interaction between me or between us and God. But if we frame vocation through prepositions, callings even become more relational and dynamic. You know what a preposition is? Well, a preposition is a class of words found in many languages that express relationship. And when I found that definition, I said, that's what I'm after with the language of vocation and the experience. If God is the source of our vocations, our callings, we have to hear and respond through dialogue, through relationship. And so I did write this little book, and I frame vocation around 8 prepositions, and I'll go through those for the rest of our time together. And again, just throw up any questions here for me. So the prepositions are by, to, as, for, through, from, in, within. Okay? Any questions about those 5 findings or, okay. Okay, by God. So Walter Brueggemann says that the dynamic of being a human, of humanness, is the interaction between the one who calls us and the one who's called, and the agenda between them is our calling. So that's a very, and talk about Christian vocation is talk about God as a caller. And in the stories that we ask people to tell. So instead of asking people to define, we ask people to tell us stories. And it was in the stories that we found their callings, their experiences of God, their sense of what they thought the purpose and meaning of their life was. And we found 3 prominent images to emerge from people's stories about who and what God called them. The first I'll call the acorn and the oak tree. So again, this goes back to the idea I already brought up, that God has a very definite kind of plan, or God's in control, or God's overseeing all the details of my life. So my life is like an acorn, and there's really only one thing an acorn can become, and that's an oak tree. And I have to figure out, God will guide me in determining that. Oh, I thought I had an oak tree, picture of an oak tree. And now, to be fair, a very few people in our research do experience God as having a pretty definite plan for them, a feeling since they were a child that they know exactly what they are to do, who they are to be. Their life is like the acorn. They become the oak tree. And I've known a few people that have had this sense. So this image points to a kind of certainty about calling. The problem is for those who don't experience God's call in this way, they often end up thinking they don't have one. And that's not true. The majority of people in our research actually experience their calling as a journey, a pilgrimage. Most found that calling was something they discovered along the way. Something, they didn't have this absolute certainty, but they had to, as the Quakers say, proceed as a way opens. And they find God along the way. And if you've been on a pilgrimage, maybe some of you have, you get lost, you take the wrong route, you find other people you didn't imagine. If the biblical images of journeys, you go through the desert, you find the Holy Temple, you go through an exile, you have many, many routes and many ways. So this powerful image spoke widely and broadly to people. The third one was an aha experience. That is like something kind of you discover, you come to see in a new and an exciting way that you hadn't quite seen before, new insight. Conversions can be like this. Okay, I have another video for you. Let's see if that works.
It's been a lifelong desire to do different things with wood. And I, as a young boy, would spend time walking through the woods and looking at the trees and trying to imagine what they were like in size and which ones I would cut up and use for lumber later. I didn't realize at the time how important that was to me. It was later in life that I look back and I say, wow, that's where it all started. And I would take my mother's peach crates and I would pull them apart and figure out different little things I could make out of them, toys or buildings. All I had was a little handsaw maybe and a hammer and some nails, but I got pretty creative with what I could do with it. There was always that desire to do something with wood. In high school, I took a wood class and I was just fascinated by what I could do making a simple breadboard. Just fascinated the heck out of me. Later in life, I took a class on whittling, and this was when after I had gotten married, and I was teaching in a high school, and it was an evening class, and all we had to do was cut little notches on a piece of wood the first night. And I remember coming home and sitting there at the table, cutting these notches on the wood, just trying to get them all even, and getting used to using a knife and a piece of wood. And I was so excited. It was like my spirit was just jumping inside with, you found it. You finally found it. This is what you want. This is what you are to do. But at the time, I figured, well, this will be just like
right when he was jumping.
and growing, and people would give me encouragement. Basically, it took off by itself, and I just kept feeding it and ended up where I am today.
Okay, so Ken has this aha experience. It's really, really a beautiful story. I finally found it. The spirit was jumping inside of me. So you see this convergence in his life. And it was kind of interesting about his story is there's just a little bit of the acorn there, isn't it? He loved that woodworking as a child. He comes back to find it in adulthood. And so what these images have said to me, God is the pilgrim, God is the planner, God is the artist, the searcher, is that we need many images of God as the caller. We don't all experience God's calling in the same way. So we shouldn't just say, well, there's only one way, or just because I haven't had your experience doesn't mean that my experience is not valid. So expanding people's repertoire for images and language around God and God as a caller has been really important to us. Okay, 2, this language is common in vocational conversations, right? So what is God calling you to? You know, to go here, to marry this person, to get this job, to live in this way. I want to emphasize Martin Luther's notion of calling here. And that is, Luther said that as Christians, we have 2 callings. Our primary calling is to live the life in Christ together in community. Our first calling is communal. We have a shared calling by virtue of our baptism. Here I'm emphasizing the call of disciples to him. He called his disciples to him. You know, disciples is, God, this is back to Laura's issue. You know, I'm not a big fan of the word laity or to be told that my calling is as a layperson. This is big in the Catholic Church, but anyway, we won't get into that. But my primary calling is to be a disciple. And we're all called into that same life together. So, but then Luther also said we each have particular callings. We each have a particular calling in that communal calling. And that's one of the differences between a Christian notion of vocation and those books that I showed you back a few slides ago. A lot of that secular literature on calling betrays our modern notion. Really, modernity inverted that and convinced us that our calling and our purpose and our meaning is about me, Kathleen, my life. And me, Kathleen, my life is important in the Christian life, but it's within the body of Christ that I find my particular callings. So I really liked Luther's idea here. That as disciples, we share in something together. And this is what we found, that the language of vocation and telling stories about our callings really bound people together in a significant and powerful way in the congregations that we worked in. That once people started to tell stories about the choices they made, how they made them, the mistakes they made, how they found a better way, whether they found a way to figure out what God was asking of them or inviting them to do or nudging them, or that those stories, the stories of calling, create really strong bonds of community. So I want to talk about as Luther's second idea, that God calls me as I am. So we're called to discipleship together as a community, but that particular calling that Luther highlighted is as the person I am. Now, of course, he lived in the Middle Ages, right? And he had kind of a static view of society. So if I was a woman, I could become a wife or go to the convent. If I was born a peddler, then I'd become a peddler. If I was born the prince, then I'd become the king. Or if I was born right? So there was a very static social system, and we don't live in that social system. We have a much different kind of social arrangement. But as I am means that, as Ed Hannenberg says, that my calling is the unique creation of me, that God has called me in this time and at this place with these abilities or disabilities, experiences, and that God's divine summons is to me. And my response can't be but a response that comes from the particularities that shape me. So some people will say, like, well, is now a Bonhoeffer moment? Well, I heard someone say recently, Bonhoeffer had to respond to his calling at his time in World War II. And I have to respond to my calling now. I'm a middle-aged white woman born in Iowa to these parents. I have these sisters. I married this guy. I got this mother-in-law. Didn't get the other mother-in-law. I teach in this university. I do this research. So the particularities of my life, gender, race, culture, all of those shape my callings and my ability to respond to those callings, and the extent to which choice is a dimension in our callings or not.
And that's how I usually define
Here's another
myself
story.
as a baker and a lover. As a baker, because I feel like baking is what I do and what I love doing. And as a lover, I think of myself as called to be a family man, to be a daddy, called to be the support of my household, and called to just love and watch over my family. And not just my family, even at work, that kind of transpired because I cares about the people I work with. I care about their lives. I care about what's going on in their respective homes. That's how God works. And that's how my life has been shaped, to care for people.
That was Francois. Sorry, I didn't introduce him. And he just told us this fascinating story. He was a sociologist who lived in, what's the name of his country? Buka, I can't ever say the place, in Western Africa, I think. And he couldn't get a job as a sociologist, so he came to the United States. He ends up as a dishwasher, in New York. And eventually the guy in the kitchen asked him to help with desserts, and he just fell in love with baking, and he became a baker. And you can see his whole video on our website. It's a beautiful story. Not every immigrant story, of course, but the story of kind of being lost and found and having to find what he could do in the circumstances in his life. We also asked children, I don't think you can see this slide really well, to tell us stories about what they're good at, what they like to do. And we made a little children's book about it. And this child took apart his mom's blender, but he put it back together again and took apart the clock. And he said, I know that other kids don't like to do that, but they like watching my work. I'm very curious. I like to try new things and have big dreams. And here's another, this child was suffered from a lot of childhood illnesses and was asking, how can I use my lack of outdoors to help? I don't know how to use it. I have no interest in sports and I have sensitive feelings. So children can articulate what they love, what they're good at, what they desire, what they hope for. Young people we often treat as if they're getting ready for their callings, because callings have to do with adulthood. And that's just not a good notion of calling. God calls young people as they are, Joyce Mercer says, with the life purposes that exist within God's purposes, not in spite of their young age, but because of it. So to help youth college students, young people who go into the military or go into the workforce. God is calling them in that place that they are. And it's not something that's down the road when you're just happy or you have it all figured out. So in that way, the language of calling can be more dynamic, even if there's a real struggle and pain and hurt in it. Patrick Reyes wrote one of the first books on calling and vocation from a Hispanic point of view. And he grew up in the barrio of Los Angeles, South Los Angeles. And he said, my first calling was simply to survive, was just to live. And so that's a powerful reminder of the constraints on our callings, or the constraints of even feeling that we might have a sense of calling. But God came and met him in that place. Okay, 4, I'm going to keep going through my prepositions here. Obviously, I could stop and talk for a while about each one of them. I'm going to check your Q&A just to see if anything else. Okay, good. Okay, 4. Well, vocation, our callings are for others. That's the simplest way to say it. God has given us something, not just for myself, but for others. And with the preposition of for, I wanted to look at work more closely. And our project was looking at work in the professions. And I just would want to make this, there's at least 3 meanings in our society: a job, and this just goes back to the very basic notion of work as a way to sustain our lives. We need to sustain in whatever society we are. We need to have the means by which we get food and shelter and those necessary things. So we tend to think of a job as something that we do in exchange for payment in our society. Career is a language that started to be used in the 19th century as the way of an individual learns through work and through self-development, self-enhancement. There's some progress in life. You know, my career is headed someplace. And then the third language is the language of profession. This is one of the oldest languages that connects work and vocation. So just real quickly and simply, a profession is a form of work that entails 4 aspects: a body of knowledge, a skill, the capacity to do something well, credentials that you get from a community of practitioners, and you do it for the common good. Now, this notion of professions, like I said, has been around for centuries. And you see it in our society, although it's weakened. But I go to have an accountant do my taxes because she has the knowledge of all those rules and regulations. She has the skill, especially to fill out the form, right? She belongs to a group of practitioners that have moral guidelines for what's right and wrong to do as an accountant. And she's dedicated to do work for me, for my well-being, not her well-being. So you see this classic notion in medicine and healthcare, in the ministry, and in law. But now you see it in almost every profession. And I'm just going to do this really quickly, but you can be a certified marketer, and there's all these standards to be a good marketer, and there's rules and special knowledge, and then there's international janitorial service, and they have a code of ethics, and they want you to be the best cleaning professional that you can be. So we see the professionalization. No. We see the professionalization of work across professions. And Bob Bella makes this link that a calling is this link between the individual and the public good. It's the way that my life, my work is given to me for the sake of others. And of course, this has, anyway, I got to keep going. I'll keep going. Well, I got to tell you this. In the last 30, 40, 50 years, there's only been 2 books written on this important link between profession and faith. there's some literature on work and faith, and it's good, but it often misses this deeper notion of being called to the work, of having a calling to it. And Dorothy Sayers has this great, the novelist has this great line that the church, she said this back in the 30s, church tells the carpenter that he shouldn't be drunk and should come to church on Sunday. Instead, the church should tell him that the very first demand of his religion is that he should make good tables, that we do our work well, and we do it for the sake of others. I love that idea.
I love languages. I always try to learn a phrase of the language of whoever walks into the job I'm at or wherever I'm at. So I'll speak Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, Armenian, anything, just a little phrase. So, and I just love languages. I come alive. If I hear someone of a different culture talking, oh my gosh, I want to communicate with them. So that's where I come alive. How I'm supposed to use that and give God glory, I'm not so sure about that, but I come alive. I've loved languages since I was a child. I've always wanted to just be able to communicate with every person, because I really believe if we can communicate with one another, even just a small greeting, it breaks down a barrier. And if we could break down the barriers in the world, people will start to talk and see that we're all human and we all have some of the same basic needs. And that's a conversation I yearn for every day. Like I said before, my work, I don't feel it's my calling, but like I'm being called. So for instance, we get worldwide doctors coming in and individuals coming in. And if I hear the language, I speak to them. I will talk with them. So in a way, I get to use what I believe is my calling in that way. And then when I talk to them over the phone, because I handle international business, immediately, if I could say one word in their language, I get to say it. Or if I write an email, I get to do it. So in a way, it's my calling, but rolled in a very different way of how God is still using me with what I believe has always been my calling since I was a child. It's great. I love that part.
Okay,
it makes a great day.
These videos are starting before I can introduce the person. And she works as the vice president of marketing and communications for a large firm in Minnesota. And her video was also up on our website. But so she articulates something that others have, particularly St. Paul points out about calling. And Michael Himes has these 3 great questions. Is this a source of joy? I'd say Charisse has a lot of joy. Does it tap into your gifts and talents? Yep. She has a gift for languages. And is this role of genuine service to people around you? Yes, she feels like what she is doing is a real service in her work and in her place of work. And we could say in our family, in our neighborhood, in our church, wherever we serve. So the preposition for gets at this notion of service, of skill, of capacity, of gifts, of charisms, whatever language you want to use there. And joy, I should say here, is not just happiness. It's not just pleasure. It's not just, it makes me feel good. Joy is a deeper sense of rightness, goodness, wholeness, integrity. It is not the absence of suffering. It is not the absence of suffering. Okay, there may be great suffering in it, but you still know it's right. It's what God is asking of you. So here's Paul. This is an image from the St. John's Bible, if you know about our illuminated Bible at St. John's. And Paul gives us this notion of gifts and charisms. And you probably know all this, but just as a reminder, Paul thinks that we don't just have one gift, we receive many from the Holy Spirit. Some are lifelong, some we have throughout our lives, but some are more short-term. Charisms can come and can go. Charisms for Paul is the power of the Spirit moving through you for the sake of the community. And Paul says explicitly, charisms are to build up for the common good. So it's not about building my resume. It's about building up the life of this community. And I think Michael Heim's 3 notes there of joy, skill or talent, and service are a good tool of discernment for us as we think about that, especially as our life changes over time. This is one of the videos up on our website, a story of Denise, who's a judge. And she just said that her path of being a lawyer just keeps making more and more of her. So she kind of found that perfect fit. Not everybody finds that, but that was the language she used. I think a lot of young adults are kind of searching for the right fit. They like this idea of skill and joy and place where I'm going to live it out, service, who are the people I'm doing this for, come together. We heard many young adults say, I'm really good at what I do, but I'm not in the right company, or I don't really like where I work. Or they might say, I really like the people I work with and the people I serve, but I'm not really doing what I'm good at. Or they might say, I'm really good at this, but it doesn't really bring me joy. So it's complicated. It can take longer, I think, in adulthood in our society to draw those things together. This is Jim Foley. He was a photojournalist who was captured by ISIS back, I don't know now, 15 years ago now. And he had become a photojournalist because he loved to take pictures of people. And he had been taken prisoner by the Libyans, I think, and then had been set free in the Middle East and came home. And then he wanted to go back during the beginning of the Syrian war. And his mother just begged him not to. And he said, but I have to. Who else is going to take those pictures and tell people, tell us what they're going through? So callings are serious. They're serious business. They entail our suffering, and for some, they entail giving up their life, like Jim did. Jim really sacrificed his life to take those pictures. And as Christians, that should not be a surprise to us, but yeah, it is, isn't it? Okay, so we've been going about an hour here. I'm just going to stop and look at the chat. Oh, you vowed to help God if God, oh yeah, that's good. Okay, good, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. Through. This is a really important one. It's probably Paul's favorite preposition. Paul loves prepositions. One God of all, who is above all and through all and in all. So one of the most important things we found is that our callings are social and communal. They are for others, but they also are through others. We are utterly dependent on each other to hear God's calling. So God calls us through others' needs, through others' situations, but we're also agents of God's calling for others. Now, I have to tell you, I have to be honest here, that some of the worst stories we heard were failures, where other people failed as God's agent of vocation. They did not heed God's call for us. In some ways, they might have blocked God's calling, or they did not mediate well what God was doing in a person's life. So I have some stories of that in my own life, but I have to say that some of the hardest stories were about poor advice or direction that came from 3 groups of people. Now, don't throw me out, but these were, parents, teachers, and pastors. And oftentimes those people discouraged a younger person from doing something, said that they could not do it, or that it was the wrong path for them, that they should follow another path, sometimes the path that they wanted for the young person. Ouch. Laura told us a story that she was a French major, and her advisor, her senior year of college, thought for sure she'd go on to do a master's degree in French and a PhD, probably like her, like the professor. But she had started to feel this sense of wanting to serve the poor. And she was thinking about doing like a gap year and going to France, using her French skills to live abroad and to live in a l'Arche community, that served the mentally and physically disabled persons. And she just said that her professor told her, listen, you got to compartmentalize your life. You can go serve, but you really want to go pursue French. But Laura said, no, there was a deeper calling. There was a restlessness in her. And she thought, that's the way God is calling me. It was safe to stay in the academic lane to go do French. But she felt if she didn't explore that restlessness now, she would miss that opportunity. Now, some people told us they got misdirected in early adulthood, but that at a later point they rerouted and pursued a calling that they heard earlier. The worst guidance people heard, particularly from parents, was just to go make money. I would say 99% of the men in our research heard that their purpose was to get money. And that skewed their callings in many ways. That muted some other desires or voices in them. And I could talk a long time about this. And others may fail us, and we may fail others if we really don't heed the way that God is calling through us. So Robert Keegan, the psychologist, says, who comes into a person's life may be the single greatest factor of influence of what that person becomes. So I told you the story about Patrick Reyes, who grew up in South Los Angeles, a very poor kid from Mexico, a lot of gang activity around him, a lot of bad influences, but he went to a Catholic school, and he had to go to school one day with his mom's turtleneck on because he had gotten beat up and he didn't want anybody to see his body. And he got called in for a dress violation, and the dean and he was utterly humiliated. But this Christian brother recognized his pain and asked him, would you like to spend the day in my office? And Patrick Reyes said that this man just sat with him and gave him the space to exist and breathe and be safe. And they were not just educating him, not just dedicated to being their teachers, but for him to flourish. And he said that was the first time I was aware of God calling me to a new life. And it came through that man. I heard God's voice through this one brother, he writes. I knew I should dedicate my life to human flourishing of my students. So a really beautiful story of how he felt called through another. And we're often called through the people that we serve. Okay, so I'm just checking the time here. Okay, good. We've got some time. I'm going to work through the last few, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers. Okay, you'll never guess what, but callings end. Sometimes God is calling us from some place or something or some kind of work or some people, a person. Callings end. And we don't often use the language of calling around this, but calling is a big part of life transitions, whether it's that young adult life transition I talked about, or later adulthood when people transition out of full-time work into some kind of what our society calls retirement, although that's kind of a ridiculous word, not one I really agree with. But I want to notice here for a moment the real experience of a calling ending and the loss we feel and the grief we feel when something ends. And like I said, we don't usually use the language of vocation here, but loss and grief are a part of every transition. In fact, William Bridges, I think, is a person who says all all transitions begin with an ending, with saying goodbye. And we might have just a hint or a very strong sense that, yes, I know this is ending and I must move on, as hard as that can be. And I have a sense that it's God telling me, come along the way. Here's the problem with the from preposition. What we really want to know from God is, what's the to? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? I get the ending part, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid to let go because I don't know definitely where I'm going to go. But you know what? It begins with the ending. And then we go through kind of a liminal phase, maybe, of where we don't know. We have to search for a while until something more definite comes out. So God is calling us, I want to say, from certain things in our life, people, places, and things, jobs end, relationships end, times of our life end. And God is calling us through that kind of valley of darkness and despair. And then God will call us from that grief, from that loss, to live anew, to live in a new way, to find new meaning and purpose in our life. Now, this one is related to my preposition in. Now, I want to go back to Luther here. Remember, I said that Luther lived in the static social system. He thought we were called in our life stations, and like nothing really changed about that. Like if you were a peddler, you were going to be a peddler. If you were the peddler's son, you're going to grow up to be a peddler. And sometimes Luther's notion of vocation, as it came down through the centuries, that static notion left Christians to be quite obedient in some really oppressive situations. It did not lead to a prophetic action against injustice, in other words. That's not such a good thing. That's not what the gospel calls us to. However, what I found in his language of in is that oftentimes our lives are in situations not of our own choosing. And we want to search for what God's calling is in that place. Okay, I'll say it again. God calls us in situations not of our own choosing. And this is important. Otherwise, the language of vocation all is about choice. And it sounds like a very middle class or upper middle class, like if you have the time and money, then you can have, think about what 3 jobs you want or what you can do with your life. So I wanted to explore calling in those places not of our own choosing, but a place where we might still have some agency to respond to how we live in that place. So in the book, I explore unemployment and underemployment. So being in jobs that aren't that fulfilling for us, or that we just have to do to get money, to get bread on the table, those kinds of situations. Now, that's not to say that all lower income jobs are not callings for people. I would never say that. That's not true. People can experience calling. My grandmother was a nurse's aide for years. She loved it. It was deeply her calling. Other people can work as a job in a nurse's aide and never experience it as a calling. Some people can be the executive vice president of a very prosperous business and hate their work. Others can find it deeply meaningful. So it's not social status or income that determines whether, in this example, whether that work is meaningful and good. There's other signs for what is a calling that help us determine that. But unemployment, especially losing your job, is a deeply painful situation, especially if you thought it was your calling. And then you say to God, hey, what is going on? I was doing what you wanted me to do and I've lost it now. So unemployment, underemployment. How about chronic illness? Nobody chooses these chronic illnesses. And as you know, we're living longer. So we're going to live with these chronic illnesses longer. And they can be slow and they debilitating and hard. And you say to God, what are you asking of me in this situation? What am I to do? I can't do what I used to do. Help me find what is my calling in this place. And third, being a caregiver. If more people are living with chronic illness, more people are being called to be a caregiver. So what is God calling me to in this situation? What can I do? What gifts do I have? What help do I need? What resources? What kind of community do I need to live out this calling? Because those callings are isolating and they're hard. Oh, I told you the story about Francois already. Oh, sorry. I keep hitting that, sorry. So Francois' story is up there, the story of the immigrant. Here's a story on our website, a video of a couple, and he has Alzheimer's, so a very difficult chronic illness. So a nice saying from Thomas Merton here that with me, it was not to be so. I had to be led by a way that I could not understand, and I had to follow a path beyond my own choosing. So I like that because it evokes that image of journey. It evokes that sense of God's my companion along the way in this suffering, in this difficult place. God has not abandoned me. And within that, even though I don't have any understanding at certain points along the way, my search, my prayer to God is help me know what my calling is in this time and place in my life. I'm going to go on to do within. All right. God is within us, and we're called finally to live within the life of God. Jesus said in Luke's gospel, the kingdom of God is within you. So this preposition points to this unbelievable mystery of the Christian faith, that this Holy One, this holy God dwells within each of us and within our community of faith. God dwells within us. But God's calling, our callings are temporal. They're in this life. But God has one calling for us in our dying, in our death, and beyond in our afterlife. And that is to dwell within the very life of God. So within captures for me this eschatological calling, this calling beyond all our other callings. This God that dwells within me, I'm ultimately called to dwell within the very life of God. So vocation, Hannenberg says, is not a detailed blueprint imposed on me. It's right here in front of me. It's me, my life lived in harmony with God's grace. That's nothing other than God's loving presence within. So as a community, we're called by God to follow as we are for service through others from loss and suffering within God. And that's a good place to stop sharing and to come back on and to, okay, I got to look at all your questions here. And I think somebody was also going to come on and ask me some questions. Okay, while we're doing that, I'm going to go back to the top of the Q&A. Somebody asked me the question, what if someone you love tells you that they have a direct conversation with the Lord? Isn't it our natural feeling to think that somebody is mentally off, something is mentally off with that person? No, I don't. Well, no, prayer is conversation. Prayer is dialogue. Prayer is an ongoing conversation. The scriptures, when we pray the scriptures every day, you know, I'm listening to what God might be saying to me through the scriptures, but I'm also having a conversation back. I'm struggling today, Lord. I'm filled with joy. This bright sun in my eyes. I'm thankful for this. So I think when we say that we hear God's voice, some people might literally hear that, Jane hears a voice in her heart. We can hear that voice in a dream. We can hear that voice through others. So voice in the Christian tradition, it means a lot of different things. So no, I wouldn't assume that person is mentally off. But we have to discern with others what is authentically God's voice and what are other voices that we hear and listen to. Okay, Evan, you're back on. Do you want to take over the Q&A?
I will in just a moment, but
Okay.
I'm having a difficulty accessing it, and I'm going to work with Samantha on getting me access to it. But why don't you continue, if you will? Thank you.
Okay, I think I saw most of these. What are some examples of good approaches or languages that children might use to encourage vocational inquiry in their children? That's great. What do you love to do? What are you good at? Why do you like to do that? What can you do something? Can you use that to, do something good for others? So use the language of joy, skill, and service. Ways of which to, how do you know you're good at that? Like we said, we had children draw pictures and write a little paragraph at what they're really good at. And we did find threads in those childhood stories often, into adulthood. And maybe a question like, what can I do to nurture what you're good at? A friend of mine recently told me, she has 5 sons, and her husband loves football, and they watch football on the weekends. And I'm going to move over here into the shade. And she hates it. She hates football, and but she realized, and her kids love to play, and she's just not a big sports person. But she finally said, no, my kids love this. How can I encourage them to do this well, to enjoy it, to and be more present to it? So I would use that language. All right, I'm not looking at the chat here. How long is one to wrestle and navigate the doubts of a new or persistent calling, getting on the fence and getting on with it? That's a good question. How long to wrestle and navigate with the doubts of a new and persistent calling? So you're sitting on the fence and you don't know what to do. Well, let's go back to a couple of those practices. Discernment, the earliest meaning of the word discernment meant sorting out what's of God and what's not of God. Ask God directly for some guidance. Lord, I need to know. What is the way for me? Should I stay on the fence or should I get off and pursue this? And we can look for certain signs. Now, I want to be careful about that language, but something's of God if it's consistent with the gospel. If other people confirm it in you, ask around, ask other people first, your pastor, your spouse, friends. I'm on the fence about this. What do you think? Take all that into discernment and sort it out. We just don't do what other people, tell us to do. We want to be wise about our risks and not just be foolish about them. Make a list of the pros and cons. Look back in the past, in your life before, and say, when are other times that I sat on the fence, that I wasn't sure? And how did I finally get off? Does that give me any sign of what to do? In the scriptures, we often hear, remember, look back and remember. Do those 3 things, joy, skills, and service, are they converging in this new or persistent calling? Persistence is a sign, like if it's of the Holy Spirit and God's not giving up, might want to pay attention to that. Okay, any others here?
Dr. Cahalan, let me ask you to expand upon that a little bit, if you would, please. In my experience, the church in ways that are both good and bad, invest a lot of resources into discerning a call to a ordination. Are there any communities, whether church or not, that invest those kind of resources in informal ways or in defined processes where groups of people, committees, individuals even have identified themselves as those who can join us in that way in a less overly involved way as a parent or a teacher or even a pastor might, but instead as someone whose role it is to just hold up to us some of those observations that you named being so important.
Yeah, that's a great question, Evan. Well, I can give two examples. I do think more and more colleges have really tried to attend to this, but not everybody goes to college. The military, I think, can be quite good as a community of helping people find what they're good at, or steering, giving younger people like the structure. One thing that we need as for young people is times to experiment, times to try out things that we're good at, that we think we might be good at. It's okay to fail or to come to a dead end and say, that's not me, or that's not what my life path is. So I do think that those creating spaces for young adults to explore more. The other would be the Quaker community, has a thing called a clearness committee. And I highly encourage you to look into this for your congregation, or if people don't know what this is. But this would be, let's say I'm on the fence, like this question in the Q&A, and I just don't know, should I stay teaching at the university or should I retire? I'll just give that example from my life. And a clearness committee is I gather a trusted group of people around me, and they listen to me talk about this and ask me questions to help me kind of sort out where, a lot of discernment is less about just like I rationally know something or not, and more like that gut intuitive feeling. There's a rightness about this. There's a goodness, there's a wholeness, and clearness committees are really good at that practice. Like I said, we have not found congregations to be places where people do this, but we have the tools in our tradition, and we could become better communities of saying we would help anybody right now who's trying to discern a calling to come forward and help them do that. So we're not so alone in our callings. Or like Laura said, just thinking, I don't even know if I have one.
I was a part of a diocese that named that limitation and attempted to have as the outcome of the discernment process not purely an up or down decision about ordination, but a clarity of call. And they were able to name it and invest some resources into it. And yet there's so much about our culture and our system as the institutional church that has learned over the maybe even centuries how to understand call so narrowly. And I appreciate your hint there. I see two people in the chat. One mentions that at Bexley Seabury, the work on baptismal living is starting to focus on that discernment, and maybe that's where some of those cultural shifts begin in the training of leaders in the church, whether ordained or lay. And another piece to note is that our speaker next week will be talking in particular about clearness committees. And so what a wonderful segue.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm a practical theologian. I teach in a seminary where we both have lay students and ordination students. And I used to teach our introduction to pastoral ministry class, of which I felt like it was a space for students to discern their call to ministry, at least at the beginning of their theological education. And I was really clear about this. And I remember I'd have one or two students in that class come to me in tears saying, I don't think that this is my calling. I think I love young people, and I thought maybe I was supposed to be a youth minister, but now after this class, I'm not supposed to be. And they would feel horrible. And I would say, no, that's great that you figured that out. Now, just because you don't feel a calling to youth ministry doesn't mean God doesn't have a calling for you. God does have callings for you. Now let's figure out what that is. But again, that sense of shame that I'm not going to be a minister, but I said no. So I decided to write a book for that class, introducing for that ministry class. And I had to work on this notion of calling, but I hated the language of vocation. I grew up a Roman Catholic, and we just have this really bad, narrow notion of vocation. And I had to do a lot of research, and it was reading Martin Luther that I realized, oh my gosh, how have I gotten this so wrong? Suddenly I realized the call to ministry in the church. Well, it's one calling among many callings in the church. It's not a higher calling. It's not a lower calling. All callings are distinctive by virtue of the gifts that God has given us. But what I realized was what's distinctive about the call to ministry is the call to ministry is to lift up all the callings in the community. That my students, it's not just putting on a good program that people come to the church, but that the minister's job is to make the first grade teacher the best first grade teacher they could be, or the best mom, or the best grandparent, or the best neurosurgeon, or the best whatever. And I had a complete conversion myself about what my calling was to train people for ministry. So it takes undoing some old scripts, though.
But so much of our Eucharistic theology is designed that way, right? We are nourished in community. We are fed to do the work. Let us go forth into the world rejoicing. That's central to our identity. And surely, clergy, priest as presider is not dishing out magic food, but inviting and naming assembly and inviting people for that to that nourishing meal. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. One person asks in the Q&A, what are some ways that someone who is called in difficult circumstances or situations, a circumstance not one that they would choose, how do you find joy in embracing that circumstance as a calling? Would you say more about that sense of accepting and embracing a circumstance beyond our control as a sense of call?
Well, first I want to say not everybody might find that situation a calling. So let's say my husband gets Alzheimer's and I have to quit teaching and I have to care for him at home. I might find that, I just don't feel like being a caregiver is my calling, but I have to do this. So I want to recognize that. I might grow into having a sense of calling within that situation. So do you see that distinction? Some people feel really called to be a caregiver. Man, they just have that kind of certainty and ambiguity. I want to recognize that we might not always just initially experience something like that or over time, but I might be able to say, okay, I don't have this just like galvanizing sense of being a call giver like I did being a professor, but I'm in this situation. Now, God, what are you calling me to? Who am I to be in this? What gifts do I have? And what don't I have? What can't I do? What do I need other people to help me with? And maybe some people would discern, I'm a terrible caregiver. I can't do this. And that's okay too. And we need a community around us to kind of support in those really difficult things where we don't have a lot of choice. But you might say, I'm terrible at this, but I got to do it. I don't have the means to do something other than this. I think the most important thing in our faith, the prophets speak of this. It's throughout the Israelite story. The cross speaks to this. God does not abandon us where we are. And God will be there with us along the way. And I think the other thing is, remember, about a third of the Psalter, at least a third of the Psalter, are lament psalms. And it's okay to say to God, I hate this. I don't feel a lot of joy here. I don't know what my joy is supposed to be. You keep saying joy comes in the morning. I don't got it. It's not unfaithful to lament our pain and situation. You are joining a great chorus of people down through history. So, but your prayer can also be, Lord, help me to find some joy in this. I want my life to be of service to you. And yeah.
Yeah, so I hear an invitation to a kind of to a holiness that is to name, not that the circumstance I'm in is necessarily where I'm called to be, that this is the end or the thing, but even in those circumstances, what's my response to them and what can I give to them, and also to recognize that we might be called from them, to use the preposition you used
right.
earlier.
That's right.
That this isn't necessarily the last stop on the
Right.
journey. Thank you. Um, would you say a little bit about the ways in which the secular community and that sort of secular language towards the beginning of your presentation talked about the ways in which sort of individual flourishing or fulfillment versus sort of an external call. What have we and what are we learning from secular exploration of discernment, of vocation, of calling, of fulfillment? How might the Christian community, or even more broadly the religious community, get back in touch with that sense of flourishing as a part of our call?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that perspective has something to offer us, and we have something to offer that perspective. One thing I think they offer is this sense of authenticity, integrity, rightness. We have the teaching in our tradition that we're called, as children of God, we're called imago Dei, that we're created in the image of God. But I don't know that we always believe it or live out of it. So I would say in that literature, sometimes there's more honoring of creativity, of individuality, of a strong sense of there's something for me to do in this world. Every person. So we could learn something from that. Like I said, they could learn something from us about community. It's not just all about me. It's not just all about what makes me feel good, what I want to do. There's suffering entailed in calling. There's the cross in our calling. There's that dimension we've just been talking about. And my calling is within this community. So I think our language, even though we might not practice it as well, offers the world something to that. We know what it means to give up our life. We follow somebody who's given up his life. And we should know what that means and see our story in that. And that perspective is really missing. Also, we just have a stronger sense of being called to justice. Sometimes you don't find that in that literature as much either. That my call of service is to relieve the burden on people, on others, who face serious injustices. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the participants asks in the chat, what are some ways that we as a congregation can hold space for each other in the various phases of our call? What does it look like? How does that start? How does that take shape? And how does that respect the diversity of journey in a congregation?
One is what I said before about life transitions. Transitions are big markers of calling, often leaving something behind and heading forward. And we have a resource on worship and prayer resources, like blessings in a congregation. And the person that wrote that book for us, she just came up with all kinds of things, like when the transition from, grade school to junior high. We let secular rituals mark these, like graduation. But what do we as a church say? You're entering high school now. You've gotten a driver's license. Let's bless these people who got driver's license and taken on this responsibility. Or we honor graduation and those going to college, but may not recognize young people who are doing other things with their lives. That it's a good thing to go and work, or the choices what they've done. Like I said, retirement. We did not find a congregation that did anything around retirement, but we found in the stories that people, And I did a lot of reading on retirement and late adulthood. So I said, that we're living longer, but we're not going to be elderly longer. We're going to be adults longer. That's what the developmental psychologists are telling us. So we're living, Americans, but really every social economic group and racial group is living longer. It means we're going to be adults longer. And if we're leaving retirement, we just made that up. We just made 65 is just an artificial number. We just made that up after World War II. We haven't really changed. Well, Social Security keeps changing it on us, but we haven't really changed our language. Retirement is not language that's really matching what people are doing, but they're going through a huge life transition, of which maybe they'll live a third of their life beyond full-time work. That's amazing. And the church does very little to help people make the transition, honor it, and discover God's calling beyond that. And people can flounder, they can go through depressions, they can do great things, they can do nothing, they can get sick, all kinds of things happen. We all know this. But we want to accompany people through these life transitions. So that's one thing I would be aware of, just helping people make transitions, but then discerning new callings, those sitting on the fence, those figuring out. My sister retired last year. Yesterday, she's told me she's bored already. What is God calling her to? What's there? What's possible? Letting people explore those things. I think all that's really, I think the other thing is creating spaces for people to share their stories is one thing we found really helpful.
We here at St. Paul's, we have a habit of offering a brief retirement liturgy in the middle of the service when usually at the end of the academic year, because we're in a university town and we see a lot of people retiring in that way. But we are guilty of not doing anything else, right? We sort of it's you've reached the journey. Here's your prayer and your blessing. Good luck with the next 30 years, right? And so what a wonderful invitation to begin to recognize that you're not just leaving something. You're called from it and to something, and the community has an opportunity to honor that, to name it, and to make space for those conversations. We do that with, when you let us know that you're expecting a child, we've got an institutional response. We're going to journey with you. We're going to celebrate you. We're going to go to baptism, nursery, and the like. And yet you've named one, and there are other, right? Loss of job, even not retirement, or divorce, or marriage, or moving to town. How do we honor the ways in which that's a vocational opportunity?
Right. The other thing I found is the way we treat older adults is we bring the church's ministry to them instead of asking them to discern what's your calling now, and what ways would you like to serve? And a lot of times in a kind of paternalistic way, we say, well, you can pray for the rest of us. Well, maybe that's not their calling. But what I'm saying is, as a community, we develop these skills to help people discern in their situation. And one time, my mother-in-law, we took care of her till she was 99. And she had this friend, a couple at this assisted living place she lived. And the man was dying, the husband was dying. And my mother-in-law would go down and sit in the room with the wife. And often, and say to the wife, go ahead and go get your lunch and I'll stay here with him. Well, my husband came home one day. He was so upset. He was like, I don't want my mom sitting in that room with that dying guy. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, she might get really depressed about death. I'm like, Dad, she's 98 years old. Do you think she hasn't thought about death? I mean, I said, no, are you kidding? God has given her a calling to be a friend, to accompany the dying, to sit with this. We're not taking this away from her. What an awesome calling, at her late time in life. So God is never not calling us to something. And prayer is a good thing to be called to.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think those are all the questions and comments, and what a good sentiment. Anything else that you would share with us before we say goodbye?
Thanks. It was really great to be with you all.
Dr. Kaylin, thank you so much for being with
So
us. What a
welcome.
rich invitation, not only to our congregation, but to others. Thank you.
Okay.
If you're watching live, we're glad that you were with us. You can see a recording of this on YouTube if you missed any part of it. Next week, we will continue our conference, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.